Welcome to Battletested with Tanya Acker. Whether you think the war in Iran is a good thing or a bad thing, what it certainly is a test of how much power a president has to engage in military action overseas. And if you do support this war, it's worth thinking about the extent of that power, because chances are that the day will come when there's another war that maybe you don't support, that might be waged by a president who you don't like. And so it's good to have a sense of what the rules are or what they're supposed to be in case the next time your team doesn't end up in first position. Senator Michael Bennet is here with me today. He is the senior senator from Colorado. He's also running for governor of Colorado. He's on the Senate Intelligence Committee. And we talk about the Iran war and what we might expect to happen next. And Senator Bennet and I also talk about the issue of opportunity itself, which I think is really being tested these days. We also talk about the Save America Act, which is currently before Congress and which has the potential to disenfranchise millions of Americans. Here I am with Senator Michael Bennet. Thank you for being here and welcome to Battletested. Thank you for joining me today, Senator Bennet.
Thank you so much for having me, Tanya. It's great to see you.
I have to start with the war, of course, and I want to really kind of address this from the perspective of constraints on executive power. That is something that has been tested by other presidencies. This president is certainly pushing the limits of executive power. But let's talk about the military operation in Iran. The War Powers Resolution was passed specifically to constrain a president's ability to engage in military operations. Presidents of both parties have blown through that resolution like it's a piece of Kleenex. Right. Reagan, Obama, Biden, Trump 1, Trump now, George H.W. Bush, all have engaged in military operations without congressional approval. What makes the war in Iran different, if it is?
Well, I think it is different, but I'd also say it's different in kind in some respects. I mean, this has been a one-way ratchet of executive authority for decades. You saw it in the Obama administration. You saw it, in the first Trump administration, and even in the Biden administration. And I think a huge part of that, this doesn't justify an illegal war, or an unconstitutional war, but a huge part of it is the corruption of Congress, the dysfunction in the Congress, the inability of Congress to actually do its job. By the way, that's becoming significant in litigation that's being held around the executive orders that Trump is using. The courts are starting to ask questions. You know what? If Congress actually cares about its prerogatives so much, wouldn't it legislate in these areas rather than letting the executive just trample over its authority? And I think the courts are beginning to say it's not up to us to fix that problem. Congress is going to have to fix that problem. And of course, what we've perfected in Congress is the ability to blame the other side and not actually do anything, or to not do any, probably a better way of saying it, not accomplish anything, and blame the other side for our failure to accomplish it. Now, in this context, I think the war in Iran is clearly, blowing past any of the prior precedents that we can think of in recent years. And the president not only failed to consult Congress, but with the exception of Israel, failed to consult our allies in the region or across the world. And so we're now in a situation where Donald Trump is the judge, jury, and executioner for the world.
The president recently said that executive power, his power as commander-in-chief, rather, was constrained only by his own morality.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And what are you, as a United States senator and your colleagues, going to do about that sort of worldview?
I think that worldview needs to be constrained and needs to be reined back in. I think Donald Trump believes that. And I think in that way, he is less constrained than any prior president. And since his morality is I think, probably not a guide that any one of us would want being the standard for our conduct as a country, then we need to make sure that as Congress, we're going to stand up for the prerogatives of the legislative branch and the American people. And it is true, we've had decades when we haven't done that. Donald Trump, I think, is showing us what the end state of that looks like, and we've got to start reining the executive back in.
What does that look like right now?
It looks like having the war powers votes that we've had, that Tim Kaine has led from Virginia, and trying to get more Republicans. So far, they have been unwilling to break from the president, but that doesn't mean that they won't. The Iranian war so far, I think, is quite unpopular with the American people, and the increase on the price of gas and other things, I think, is going to continue to gnaw at the president's popularity, and that may change the way Republicans on the floor actually deal with this.
What does the end of this war look like? So let's just say the bombing stops. The president's indicated that it may stop very soon because there's nothing left to target. The Ayatollahs are still in power. We don't see like we're anything close to having regime change.
Unless you count regime change as installing somebody who's 30 years younger than the 84-year-old mullah that you took out and more radical. I mean, that Trump said that the reason he was doing this, and the Israelis said they were doing this for regime change because somehow there was going to be a popular uprising in Iran that was going to lead to a totally different regime. And instead, what they did was accelerate the transfer of power from the radical mullah who was there to his son.
What does the future relationship with Iran look like?
I think it's going to look a lot like the previous relationship with Iran. Look, I do believe that we can never, the world cannot afford for Iran to have nuclear weapons. The mullahs can't have nuclear weapons. It would be like having another North Korea, only with a, jihadist view of the world. That's really, really bad for the world. And Donald Trump made the decision that to deal with that problem, he was going to try to decapitate Iran from the air. And I think that it was I'm on the intelligence committee. Everybody that I'm aware of that looked at this said that you're not going to be able to decapitate the regime from the air. You'll be able to weaken them, and they've certainly have been weakened as a result of this. But to your point, I think Donald Trump can't withstand. He probably thinks he himself cannot withstand a 50% increase in gas prices for another week. And I would guess that by next week, you're going to see Donald Trump wrapping this up, claiming that he has succeeded, even though the regime is still the regime that he attacked, and even though they are still going to be in the governing position in this 90 million person country.
World War II junkies like me remember a time when, America came in, we saved Western civilization, what we did to prep an invasion of France, right, in World War II. There was a French opposition. There was a French resistance. They were softening the ground for us. There was a leader in exile, Charles de Gaulle, who was rallying French forces. And people were waiting and ready for us to come in to help take their country back. You're on the Intelligence Committee. Tell us what you can about whether or not there is an Iranian opposition that is similarly mobilized, similarly organized, and similarly ready to take advantage of what is now a much weakened Iranian position.
There isn't. I wish there were. I really wish there were. I mean, part of me feels like, I wish I could sit here and tell you that we have taken actions that are going to rid the mullahs of ever having nuclear weapons. I wish that I could say to you there's a resistance in waiting that is going to be able to take advantage of the damage, and it's been serious damage that we've done to their arsenal. But unfortunately, the answer is Iran is now under martial law. Iran is now governed by a 53-year-old mullah who is more radical than his father, and we have and they're doing the obvious things that Iran would do, which is mine the Straits of Hormuz and show that they can raise the price of energy very quickly if that's what they need to do to have a president back off. And now you're going to have a president, I think, walk away from this over the course of the next week. That would be my prediction. So they will be less powerful. They will be less lethal. They will be our neighbors in the region probably will be happy not to be under the onslaught of the missiles that Iran has built over these years, but this regime will still be intact. And tragically, the Iranian people will still be trapped in a situation that no human should have to live in.
What do you make of the reports that Russia is providing intelligence on American military positions
There's
in
no
Iran?
doubt that there is no doubt that the Russians are doing that, and I agree with my friend Gene Shaheen from New Hampshire, who wrote an excellent piece in I think the Washington Post this week about how Donald Trump has kind of rolled over for Putin, and he's done it twice here. He's done it in the context of the attack on Iran. The rising energy prices have helped Vladimir Putin. He's done it because we have not stood the way we should have stood with Zelensky and the Ukrainians in that war. And I think that Putin will continue to take advantage of Trump's inability to see that he's in it for himself and nobody else.
Do you think there will be any consequences for Russia as a result of them aiding a nation state that we are, in effect, I don't care if you want to call it a war, they say it's a war, it's not a war, we are bombing another country, we're taking aggressive action against another country. Russia is aiding that country.
They should be sanctioned for it. We should continue to make sure that we make it as hard as possible for Putin to sell his oil around the world. We should make sure that we have a constant and enduring support for the Ukrainian people who have been on the sharp end of the stick for not just for Ukraine, but for democracy and for the West, as you described it earlier. Speaking of World War II, this is one of the first major incursion since we set up the post-World War II international rule of law, and Putin invaded Ukraine, and we need to stop it, or at least we need to make sure that the Ukrainians are supported in a way that can allow them to stop Putin, and that's what they've done so far. And Donald Trump, unfortunately, has not had the discipline to support them in the way that he should have. And perhaps this failure to push back on Putin's use of intelligence to support the Iranian regime against our efforts will lead other Republicans in the Senate to push back against President Trump as well.
When you are engaging with foreign leaders, what do you say to them right now about what America is and is not? I think we're really at a moment in our country's history where we are once again, where our sense of national identity and our sense of what it is to be an American is truly being tested. What do you say when you're engaging with foreign leaders about who we are as a nation?
It's interesting because it's changed since the first Trump administration. The first Trump administration, our allies in Europe and other places were willing to look at that and say, you guys just made a mistake. Everybody gets a mulligan now and then, and we're going to give you a mulligan. Now we took 4 years off and we sent Donald Trump back, and people around the world that are allies look at that and say, we must have done that on purpose. And they're worried about our commitment to the rule of law. They're worried about our commitment to democracy. And that is on top of a question, I think, that is arising around the world, which is whether or not the American economy can generate economic opportunity for our people anymore, whether we can generate economic mobility. We in post-World War II, I think we have always been strongest when we stood both for opportunity and for freedom. The two things go hand in hand, not that we ever executed any of it perfectly, but those two things go hand in hand. And now you've got people around the world that are wondering why the richest country in the world can't supply, for example, health care to our people, why young people can't afford to go to college without spending 30 years or 40 years paying back their student loans, or why child care costs more than college does in America. They're asking those questions. And at the same time, they're asking about the commitment to the rule of law. And I think they're connecting those two things together. And in my mind, those things are very, connected.
You said that a lot of folks are thinking now we sent him back on purpose. The people who voted for him, and there were very, very many of them, they did send him back on purpose. I mean, I would submit
They
that
did.
Nothing this president says or does is a surprise, except even the surprises aren't a surprise because he's always proven himself to be a not the most predictable character. But if you had to take a step back, right, and sort of think about, put yourself in the minds of some of the many, many people who voted for him. I mean, I have heard an analysis that sort of goes the following way. He's unpredictable. The world is full of bad people. You need a strong man to stand up to the strong men around the world. And for the most part, they are strong men. And so, you need a bully to fight a bully. What's your response to that?
So first of all, I want to say I agree completely with you that this was not a mistake, other than maybe by the Democratic Party. Like I blame Trump for all kinds of things, but getting elected is not one of the things I blame.
Yeah, he just won. He won.
He won twice. That's hard to do. That is really hard to do. And the coalition that he built the first time was not as large as the coalition he built the second time. And by the way, he built that coalition after he took away a woman's right to choose. So here you have a political figure in America who succeeded at winning the presidency, took away the first civil right since Reconstruction that any president has ever taken away from the American people, and then he gets reelected again after a 4-year absence. And to me, that is not his failure. That is the failure of his opposition, the Democratic Party, of which I'm a part, to have a compelling view of what the future is going to look like. And it's staggering. I mean, in my mind, Trump should never have won the first time, much less the second time. And I think there are a bunch of people in Washington, D.C. who don't even understand that we've been repudiated, much less why we were repudiated.
This podcast is called Battletested. One institution or one group of folks that are sorely being tested right now is your party, the Democrats. What is the plan? If you go back a few decades, now I'm aging myself, you remember when Newt Gingrich came into office, when he took back the House, they had a contract with America. It was easy to understand. Whether or not you agree with all of the bits and pieces of it, it was a message that people could get behind, and they took back Congress. I mean, they really sort of gave their party a branding that people could get behind. What is the Democrats' brand? Because it is a party that is so broad, it seems hard to get it all under one
I agree
tent.
with you, by the way, on your Newt Gingrich description, and I would use another example, dating myself, which is when Bill Clinton and that crew came together after we had lost, I think, 3 elections in a row, and they realized that it wasn't the American people's fault that they kept losing. It was the Democratic Party's fault, and we had to figure out what it was going to look like to go forward. I'm not saying it's the same policy agenda that Clinton had. And in fact, some of what he did in terms of trade and other things has been counterproductive. But we've got to go back to that root and branch. In my mind, this is not just a messaging problem. This is being disconnected from where a majority of the American people are. And where are a majority of the American people? Majority of the American people are living in a country where if you are a young man, we still have a gender gap in America, but if you're a young man in America in your 20s, you're making 40% less today in real dollars than you were in 1976. If you're 30 years old, you only have a 50% chance of making what your parents made. If you look at the economy, the top 1% of Americans or the stock market, the top 1% of Americans own 50% of the value of the stock market, and the bottom 50% of Americans own 1% of the value of the stock market. We are living in a gilded age. And in that context, it's not surprising to me that people voted for, to use your words, a strong man who said to them, in the context of a world where the American dream was farther and farther out of reach for more and more people, who said to them, you don't need a democracy. You don't need the rule of law. You should expect your private sector and your public sector to be totally corrupt, totally bankrupt, and you're a sucker if you believe anything else. And that's his dark vision. That's the dark vision he got elected on twice, and it's a vision that comes with, in his case, and it's not surprising because this happens when people lose the economic opportunity, with division, with chaos, with hatred as part of what is lifting him up. And we have to have a different theory of the case. And my view is that we've got to have a theory of the case that says we actually are going to address the fact that people can't afford childcare anymore without one parent staying at home, that people can't afford to send their kid to preschool because it costs more than college, because people are living in the richest country in the world and literally can't afford childcare or health care, or the health care they're getting and the private insurance they're getting costs them more than an arm and a leg and has a deductible that never allows them to get covered. Not to mention an education system that's not teaching our kids to read or do mathematics or be ready for the 21st century economy that they're inheriting. Trump doesn't care about any of that stuff. So what he's offering is chaos. We have to offer a vision that says this exercise in self-government, that is our democracy, can actually lift people up economically again, that we can be sure that if we work hard and our kids work hard, that the American dream is still available to them. And too many Americans don't believe that anymore. And the data bears it out.
What advice would you give your colleagues? And we'll talk a little bit about your leaving the Senate and running for governor of Colorado, but you're still there. What advice would you give your colleagues, your Democratic colleagues, about how to better engage everyday people on these issues that matter to them? Gas, groceries, the cost of education, finding a job. I mean, look, when you and I came out of law school, the world was different. There was more opportunity. There just was. I guess I'm dating myself again, but people now are graduating with mountains of debt and no job. So what do the Democrats need to say or do to make some of these lofty goals realizable? How do they realize them?
First of all, jobs has to be our agenda. That has to be our agenda. And it's got to be an economy that's producing high wage jobs too. We can't just accept the fact that this economy for the rest of time is just going to produce real gains for the people at the very top and make everybody else's life a misery. It's going to be hard to dig out of the situation that we're in, out of the trickle-down economics that we've had. But I think that's going to be really important. And the party needs to be for economic growth. The party needs to be for growing businesses and making sure we're cutting red tape for small businesses. Do you think there's a person in America who runs a small business who thinks that any of the leadership of Congress is on their side? I don't think so. And I don't think they believe it. And I think that on health care, we should be clearly for universal health care for the American people. I have a different proposal than Bernie does. He's got a proposal basically to make illegal everything except for, well, let me say it this, it's better to say it this way. His Medicare for All plan would basically make illegal all private medicine, all private plans in America. I don't think America will ever go for that. But will America go for a public option where every family can decide for themselves whether they want a plan administered by Medicare or whether they want to continue to pay private insurance for that plan? I think they would. And I think we'd find ourselves quickly getting in line with the rest of the industrialized world in terms of our delivery of health care, just as one example. I think that we need to be, for a system of education where that's graduating kids from high school with the skills to earn a living wage. We're not doing that today as a country. There's not even a state that can say that. That's one of the reasons I'm running for governor of Colorado, because I want Colorado to be the first state in America that can say that. Every other industrialized country in the world can say that when kids graduate from high school, they're earning a living wage, not just the minimum wage.
Do you think that Democrats need to engage with, let's just say, the moneyed classes in a different way? And I'll point you to the proposed billionaire tax. By the way, for the record, I'm not a billionaire. I'm not even close. Not even close.
You might be. You might
no,
be.
No, no. I'm a long way away from that. But as the theory goes, as the theory goes, California has the largest wealth gap in the nation. Okay. I'd also point out that we are one of the highest taxed group of folks in the nation, especially for those of us who make our living getting paid and not inheriting money or not living off of capital gains or property. If you make a decent amount of money, let's just say a lot of money, going to work every day, you're paying taxes through the nose. Now, again, that's not most billionaires, but if the idea is that raising taxes is going to necessarily close the wealth gap, then my state, California, should be a lot more equitable than it is. So it seems to me that there is sort of a misalignment between the theory and the proposed remedy
think there's
to
a
the
massive
problem.
misalignment. I think that, what states should be for is creating high-paying jobs and helping people afford the stuff they need to live a middle-class life. Our families have lost the benefit of high-paying jobs, one, and two, they have much less purchasing power than they did in the 1970s or 1980s, and that's really problematic, because if you feel like you cannot keep your head above water no matter how hard you work, that's when people turn to the kind of strongman stuff that Trump is presenting. And having said that, we need to have a tax system that's fair, and the one we have is not fair. The one we have is letting people, that are the people in our society that are the wealthiest, that have benefited mightily from the asset inflation and real estate inflation that we've had. They're all benefiting from that because it's a tax code that favors their kind of wealth over work. And I think that's something we should be trying to fix at the national level. For example, I would strongly support a federal tax to make sure that the lucky progeny and offspring of these billionaires don't inherit the benefit of what they got, because that's how you're going to create a permanent aristocracy in the United States of America. On the other hand, I'm not going to be for a tax in Colorado that's going to chase the wealthiest people out of our state, because that's not going to benefit Colorado. And I think you're seeing that with the design of that billionaires tax in California. This is a moment when we need to be competitive, on taxation. We need to be competitive in terms of red tape and regulation, I think, as states. And at the same time, we do need a progressive tax code, I believe, both in this nation and in our states.
Let me just jump back quickly to the conversation we were having about the benefits of the perceived benefits, I should say, by some of a strong man in power, however you might define that.
By the way, I'd be much happier with Tanya Acker in power than the strong man that we have. So.
Oh, Senator Bennet.
It's true. It's true.
I'm just here with my podcast trying to have a conversation with the world. You're too kind. Do you think there's anything that this president is getting right in the area of foreign policy?
I would say that he got right his preternatural sense of China and how we had failed to manage our trade policies well, and the cost, that there's a very serious cost that has created for manufacturing and for our tax base here in the United States. And in fairness to Trump, those aren't words that usually come out of my mouth. He saw that much earlier than a lot of other people, a lot of other politicians saw it. And I think that's part of the reason why he got elected twice. So that is one place that he was sort of right in his diagnosis. I think it's been pitiful to watch him roll over for Xi Jinping in their trade negotiations. I think it's pitiful for him to have decided that he's going to send us some of our most sophisticated chips, to pay for soybeans so he can claim that he's actually done something for the American farmer. That has not been a great trade for us, but he did call the question.
The Senate historically has been known as something of a collegial body. Query whether or not that's still true. You can speak to that. But let me ask you this. Is there a Republican, someone on the other side of the aisle, who you would call? You don't have to tell me who it is yet, especially not until you get to the second part of my question. Is there a Republican who you'd consider like a great friend, like somebody when it's had a hard day, like Susan, let's call so and so and their partner, I need a drink, let's go to dinner, let's go skiing. Like, do you have somebody on the other side who's like, your person?
Honestly, the list has gotten really, really short, Tanya. I mean, there was a time when I would have had a list of 10 or 15 people I could have answered that question. That was a time when John McCain and Jeff Flake and Lindsey Graham and Bob Corker and those guys were all still here. And that's a time, the sort of the ebb tide of that time would have been a time when I told you that 40% of the Republicans are people who think Trump is crazy and they barely even a Republican and they wouldn't support him. And then there's a group that's scared of Trump. And then there is this tiny group of people that are his true believers. Today, there are an awful lot that are true believers in Donald Trump. They think that he has won two tough elections. They are sort of, at least politically benefiting, they think, from the kleptocracy that the Trump family represents, which is, by the way, another piece that we didn't talk about earlier. But when I was talking about his vision as being a corrupt public sector and private sector, part of that is allowing himself to enrich himself and his family to the tune of billions of dollars of crypto while he's in the White House. That is something that the American people, I think, in the long run are going to say, we don't want presidents who do that. Just like we don't want presidents who go to war by themselves, who think that their only constraint is their own morality. But in order for us to demonstrate that, we're actually going to have to win elections. But in the current Senate, unfortunately, an awful lot of it has become a cult of personality for the president. I wouldn't describe it as a orthodox or conventional or traditional Republican view of the world. And then, of course, we talked about this earlier, but on the other side, the Democratic side, I think there's a lack of coming to grips with the question of, were we repudiated? And if we were repudiated, why were we repudiated?
I think there were so many anomalies about the last election. We didn't have a contested primary. I think that may have thrown some people off. There were, but hindsight's 2020, and I don't mind saying I think that Vice President Harris ran the best campaign that she could under the circumstances. She did the best with the hand that she was dealt.
I agree 100%. And you may remember that I was the first national Democrat, certainly the first person in the Senate, to go on national television and say we were going to lose in a landslide after Joe Biden's terrible debate with Donald Trump if we didn't make a change. And I think my colleague, my old colleague, she's not old, but, from the Senate, Kamala Harris, I agree 100% with your diagnosis. I think she did as well as she possibly could have done with the hand that she was dealt. And the reality is, I don't think this is the only reason why we lost, but Joe Biden should never have run for re-election. We owe him a huge debt of gratitude for beating Trump the first time. And I'm not sure anybody else could have beaten Trump the first time. I think it was Joe Biden. I ran. Nobody even remembers that I ran in that cycle. But Biden won the nomination and he beat Trump. And it was an incredible thing. And after the infrastructure bill and after the Inflation Reduction Act and after the other accomplishments that he had, if he had said, you know what, I'm done. I'm turning this over to the next generation, and we're going to have a contested primary, I do think the odds are we would have beaten Donald Trump the second time.
You talked about as you described it, the Trump kleptocracy. And I should say, you also mentioned earlier in our conversation, corruption in Congress. Let me throw this out there. To the extent it's a kleptocracy, maybe people don't care because they think that so many politicians are corrupt. Congress can insider trade. So maybe Trump is only different in that he does it better, doesn't really care what we think, doesn't care about covering his tracks. What do you say to that?
I think there's some truth to that. And I think it goes far beyond stock trading, although I support the legislation to stop that. I think it goes beyond that. I think the next generation of Americans believes it is almost entirely corrupt. You know, they hate politics. They hate, obviously, this is a generalization, but I think it's largely true. They hate politicians. They hate both political parties, and they think my generation has been in it for ourselves. You know, it's what Scott Galloway says about the way we've accrued this wealth, and we haven't left anything behind. Think about, and by the way, a lot of that has to do with stuff, you know, that Congress did. We supported. We had a massive fiscal intervention after the Bush housing crisis. We had a massive fiscal intervention after after COVID. We had a period of time where the Federal Reserve had rates at zero forever and quantitative easing forever that juiced the stock market and the asset values of people that owned big houses in America. And meanwhile, if you're a working young person, you couldn't buy houses when interest rates were at zero because houses were becoming so expensive. And now when interest rates are at 7, you're shut out of the market again. That's 15 years of not being able to begin to build a life of wealth because you haven't been able to access equity in the housing market, as an example. And I think they think it's corrupt in the sense that we've hoarded economic opportunity for ourselves. And obviously, I think they think it's corrupt in the sense that Citizens United, in the hands of the wealthiest people in America, have kept people off the topic that we need to get on, which is the economic opportunity and prosperity of the American people, and in particular of the next generation of Americans. And I guess I would add, just having seen it myself, I think there's been a massive corruption of the system by social media and its effect on our politics and our effect, you know, our inability to actually close over the partisan impulse that's happening at any given minute of the day that is requiring politicians to play to an ever-diminishing base on both sides, with an agenda it's not just about the division, it's about the fact that we can't get to the question of what are we going to do about the fact that our reading scores are worse than they were 30 years ago? What are we going to get to the fact that we don't have a tax code that supports work and instead benefits people with the greatest assets? What are we going to do about the healthcare issues and the child care issues? We've done nothing to address any of that stuff. We're having a fight over what the subsidies look like for Obamacare. That's important, but none of that is dispositive to the next generation about whether they're going to have health care or not, really.
What's keeping you up at night right now?
What's keeping me up at night is worried that we're going to find ourselves in a place where Trumpism hangs around for another election and for an election after that, and that we find ourselves in a place where we can't transmit our democratic values and our small d democratic values and principles to the next generation of Americans, and that we accept the world where might makes right and where corruption is expected and where no American can reasonably expect for their family to get ahead in a generation. That really worries me a lot. I know that's a lot of stuff, but that is, I think, the heart of the concern of our democratic system. And the question is, I mean, I don't think there's any reason to expect that a democracy will exist very long if you don't have economic opportunity for the people. And that's what we've got to find a way to restore.
I think that we're at a moment in time where the people who run the country on both parties are really seen as unrelatable, almost as if you folks are a different breed. I want you, Senator Michael Bennet from Colorado, running for governor of Colorado, tell people about a really hard time. Like, what's been your struggle? What are the things, and I know, you've had health issues that you've overcome, but what is the thing that you had to struggle with that really helped you, or a struggle that you had to get past in order to kind of get to the next place? Something personal. Like it's easy always to, I think, fall back on the policy, but what's been hard for you just as a human?
I think what has been hard as a human is that we have. I mean, when I was raised in a family where my dad was a public servant, he actually worked, believe it or not, on Capitol Hill for a lot of my childhood, working for senators and doing policy stuff. My mom and her parents um, were immigrants to this country, having survived the Holocaust. She was born in 1938 in Warsaw, Poland, and they never had any doubt that in America, no matter where they were from, no matter what their religion was, and no matter what the experience they had had, which, by the way, was one of the worst experiences in human history, that they could play a role in strengthening our democracy, that they could play a role um, in making it a better place. And I think it's really depressing that it feels more out of reach today than it did, in 1983 when I was graduating from college. You know,
But how does that touch you personally? I mean, it's not out of reach for you. It's not out of
well,
reach for your family.
it's touched me personally, I think, because my whole life's work has been about trying to fulfill the promise of this democratic system, and that's not a policy issue for me. I mean, look, I had a successful business career in Colorado before I became superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, a school district filled with kids of color, filled with kids living in poverty, and we worked incredibly hard in a very, very challenging environment politically and from a policy point of view that kept me up night after night after night after night. But there was a war worth fighting. And in the end, we saw really substantial gains in student achievement. But as a nation, our kids' reading scores are now lower than they were 30 years ago. And in my own old school district, the kids are not doing as well as they did 15 years ago or 20 years ago when I was working there. And I think that is a real indictment of what we say we care about in this, as a generation, I think.
I know we're at time, but just indulge me. One really important question, really important topic. Voting rights have always been challenged and tested in this country. It is a continuing fight. The President's Save America Act would restrict mail-in voting, require proof of citizenship. Voting right advocates are alarmed. Many Americans, maybe half, don't have passports. If you're an older Black American born in the South, you may not have been born in a hospital. That was not uncommon, and may not have a birth certificate. Married women have last names that don't necessarily match their identification. What's your response to the Save America Act, and what's yours? And are Democrats prepared to do anything about it to the extent that they believe that it's going to severely limit?
Yeah, we have to do everything we can to stop it. It would be probably the worst thing that Donald Trump has done to our democracy if that ends up passing. So far, John Thune has been saying that he's not going to bring it to a vote in the Senate because a vote would lose. That means that there are some Republicans that would vote with the Democrats. We need to make sure that we keep that true, because if this thing comes over here, or if Donald Trump gets rid of the filibuster to pass it, we're going to have a huge, huge problem. But Tanya, I want to also just react to something you just said, which is really, really important, which is that this fight has been with us forever, and this fight has been with us forever. It has been with us forever. And there are moments when I go to town halls these days when people have been spending all day watching cable television or, mainlining social media. And you would think that we're living in the worst moment in American history, that there is no hope. People say, how can we have any hope? Or the fact that you have any hope is an indictment of you, because it shows that you're not coming to grips with the fight we need to lead against Donald Trump. And I just want to say, I totally disagree with that. I think it dishonors the people in our country that have fought for freedom in far worse moments than the one we're in right now. And we have a responsibility. We have an obligation. I know you don't need to hear this lecture from me, but we have a responsibility and obligation to make sure our kids know the lessons of those people that fought through the times that were even worse than this one. And that, in my view, that is the only way we can honor their memory, is by pulling their example forward to the next generation and say, you've got a role to play here. You have a duty to save the country, even though you have every reason to think it's corrupt. But you have no more reason to think it's corrupt than John Lewis did when he subjected his skull to the billy clubs on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And it's one of those moments that we're in right now, whether you're talking about the bill that you were just talking about on the floor of the Senate, or the other efforts to deny people the right to vote, or Donald Trump treating red states and blue states differently, or saying that it's his morality that should make the decisions in our democracy. I mean, all of that means that it's all at stake. And I think, Tanya, that we were living in a Gilded Age 100 years ago, almost exactly, very similar to the one that we're in right now. And in that moment, the American people invented the ACLU. It had to, you're a lawyer, it hadn't existed before. The American people invented the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. It hadn't existed before. The American people invented the modern labor movement that Roosevelt inherited to carry us out of that reactionary age and into the progressive age that he built with the American people that lasted for generations. That is the moment that we're in right now. And if we don't get up off our couches, if we don't have, shut off our television sets or that social media feed, if we transmit a view to our children that this is a hopeless situation, it will become a hopeless situation.
I am so glad that we're ending on that note. I like regularly to say that I am living my ancestors' biggest dreams. And frankly, my friend, you, the son of a Holocaust survivor, I think that you are too. Senator Michael Bennet, thank you so much for your time. I could keep you here longer. I know you have stuff to do. You're leaving the Senate to run for governor.
Thank you, Tanya.
Do come back. Do come back.
Come to Colorado. Come to Colorado.
I'm there. Say less. Say less. I love your state. Thank you, Senator. Be well.
Bye. Thank you.